change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of Acts. So grab your Bible and let's get started.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go.
Because the truth is, if God wants to save Gentiles, there is nothing that anybody can do about it. There's nothing that Peter can do. There's nothing that the church can do. But we have to understand that at this time, no one understood that the church was to be one body made up of Jews and Gentiles, and how we're all united in Christ through his cross. Not until Paul came to explain it to us in his letter to the Ephesians in chapter 2 and 3, which was still a mystery at this time, where God was just beginning to reveal this mystery to the church. And what this passage should do to us. This passage should end all of our prejudices that we find in the church, because most of our matters over cultural differences are very minor compared to the differences between being a Jew and a Gentile. So we shouldn't let these little things divide us in the church. And when I was saved, and even before I was saved, it used to be things like clothes, what you could wear, dresses or slacks, or it was head coverings. Do you have to wear a hat or no hats? Or are you allowed to wear makeup? And some of the churches, they were limiting the kind of food that you could eat. Where today it's probably more things like tattoos or body piercings or some kinds of like makeup, like maybe goth and hairstyles like shaved or colored or whatever. But there's still all these controversies over drinking and smoking and maybe vaping. But with these things that are not clearly listed as sin, which are just these external things, they're not important. They're not worth dividing over in the church. But what we do see here in our story, that this eventually will be a two-sided coin, where here we see this party of the circumcision, that they're wanting the Gentiles to become Jews. But later we're going to see in the church where the Gentile believers, they want the Jews to stop being Jewish, and they're going to want them to start becoming like the Gentiles. But the bottom line here is that we're supposed to receive those who God has approved of. We're to receive those God has received. Okay, so now we get down to verse 19, and we're being told that this persecution that started way back in chapter 8, which occurred right after the stoning of Stephen, and you have to remember who Stephen is. Stephen, he was one of those 7 deacons who was chosen to serve at the tables. He was that one who went out to the Hellenistic Jews from the synagogue of the freedmen that was in Jerusalem, which was probably the Apostle Paul, when he was known as Saul of Tarsus. It was probably his synagogue, where this is now talking about some of those Christians that fled that persecution that was spearheaded by Saul, that they're now up here in Antioch, where Antioch is 300 miles north of Jerusalem. And so now it's saying that some of these Christian Jews up here in Antioch are from Cyprus and from Cyrene, which kind of makes me wonder if some of these Jews had become believers from Stephen's ministry, because those were the countries of the people of the Hellenistic Jews that Stephen was arguing with at that synagogue. And Antioch, this place where they fled, well, Antioch is the capital of Syria. But you don't want to confuse this Antioch with the Antioch in chapter 13 that we'll read about in a couple weeks. And that's because there were at least 15 different cities named Antioch at this time. And it's all because 300 years before this time, this city was founded by Alexander the Great, one of his generals who succeeded him, whose name was Seleucus. And Seleucus, what he did is that he named this large, beautiful city after his father, Antioch. And General Seleucus, he liked his dad so much, he did it 15 more times. And so you might think Kirkland was named after me by my kids, but my kids, they never named anything after me. So I think probably Kirkland was named after Costco's father. But this city named Antioch, this is the greatest of all the cities named Antioch. And it was called Syrian Antioch, or Antioch on the Orontes. And Orontes, all that means, that's just the name of a river. But this wasn't only the greatest city named Antioch, but this was also the third greatest city in the whole Roman Empire. And at this time, the Roman Empire was the whole known world. And so the only cities that were greater than this Antioch was Rome itself, which was the first, and then Alexandria in Egypt, which was the second. And then being only 20 miles from the Mediterranean Sea, it was also a seaport city, where today this Antioch is in the country of Turkey, and it only has a population of 3,500 people. But at this time, Antioch had a population of 500,000 people, and it had the title of being Antioch the Golden, the Queen of the East, which is not like the land of Oz with the Wicked Witch of the West. This is Antioch the Golden with its Queen of the East. And even though it's called golden, it didn't have streets of gold, like gold bricks, like the land of Oz had. But its main street was paved with pure marble, which is also very expensive. And it was paved with this marble for over 4 miles. And those streets, they were not only just paved with marble, but they were also lined with these marble colonnades. And what a colonnade is just a bunch of columns, but they're all connected at the top. Where this was the only ancient city in the ancient world that had street lights that were lit every night, lighting up the whole 4 miles of the city streets. And since it was a seaport city, that means that this city was full of luxuries, which attracted all kinds of rich people, like wealthy, rich, retired Roman officers, who they spent their days chatting away in the bathhouses, which we would call spas today, or else they would be gambling at the races. So to me, this kind of sounds like Florida. It's got all the spas, and it has all the dog races, and I'm not sure they were racing dogs, maybe it was horses, but it sounds like a great place to retire, just like Florida. But this was a great commercial city which had great political power, which also made it a great place for evangelism. So this would be like going to San Francisco, because this was not the most immoral city like Las Vegas, but this was the second most wicked city in the area. So it's like San Francisco, where in the ancient world, Corinth was the most immoral city. But Antioch here, it also had all these shrines for all the Greek and Roman gods. So it had the cult of Artemis and Apollo, but the local favorite was this shrine of Daphne. Now this is not the Daphne from Scooby-Doo. This was a Daphne that was worshipped by ritual prostitution. And we never saw anything like that happening in Scooby-Doo, not with Shaggy or Velma or Fred. So this is a different Daphne. And so now, what really seems strange here, and which is actually really a big deal, is that now we have these Hellenistic Jews, the same ones that Stephen was arguing with, who had become Christians, and now they're all up in Antioch, and they were originally from Cyrene and Cyprus. So that means that they were Hellenistic too, and they're bringing the same gospel message that Stephen preached, but now they're bringing it to Hellenistic Gentiles in Antioch. And this is a lot different than Peter going and bringing the gospel to Cornelius. Because first of all, Peter, he was an apostle. And secondly, Cornelius, he was a God-fearer, which means that he was already worshiping the true God of Israel. And these are just a bunch of nobody Hellenist Christian Jews. So that means that these are just regular, ordinary church members. And now they're doing this out of their own free will. And they're bringing Christ's message to these absolute pagan Hellenistic Gentiles who are entrenched in the middle of practicing their pagan beliefs, where they're worshiping idols with all their immoral practices, belonging to all these idolatrous cults. And now all these Gentile pagans, they're all getting saved. So this is just like the movie Jesus Revolution. And where it says here, the hand of the Lord was with them, and it says a great number believed. So it is a Jesus revolution where they're all turning to the Lord. And it's like the hippies did, and they're all getting saved. And then the news of this great revival among these pagans is traveling everywhere, where this news gets down to the church in Jerusalem. But instead of the hippies being saved, it's pagans. And so they don't send a reporter from Time magazine, but they send Barnabas to check on what's going on up there, to make a report, to see if these reports are true. And so good old Barnaby Jones, he travels that 300 miles north, which if he traveled 10 miles a day, it would have taken him a month to get there. And you have to remember who this Barnabas was. He's the same guy whose name was Joseph that the apostles renamed Barnabas, which means the son of encouragement, because this was a very encouraging guy. And he was also a Levite because he had sold his property, which was probably a property that he owned in Cyprus, because that's where he was from. And so some of these guys that we're reading about here, they too were from Cyprus. And the reason it's believed that Barnabas sold his property in Cyprus is because Levites, they weren't allowed to own property in Israel according to the law. And then if you remember, he gave all of those proceeds to the church, where this sale got Ananias and Sapphira in a lot of trouble. But he is also the same Barnabas who introduced the former terrorist Saul of Tarsus, who becomes our apostle Paul, to the other apostles. And that was when everybody was afraid to meet him because they just thought it was just another terrorist trick. And so this is the guy that the church picked to send to Antioch. And it's because, like it says here, it says he was a good man, full of the Holy Spirit and faith. And so when he gets up there and he saw the grace of God, he was glad because he sees that this Jesus revolution is going on. And then it says here in verse 23 that he encouraged them. And that's because that's what this man does. Because what else does a man do who's named the son of encouragement? He goes around and he encourages people. And so now he stays up there in Antioch and he worships with these new believers, and he makes no difference between these Greek believers and himself, where they're all saved by grace, by believing on Jesus' atoning work on the cross in their behalf as the payment for their sin. But now you have all these new believers who were all pagan Gentiles, where they're not Hebrews, so they have very little knowledge of Hebrew scriptures. So they have very little knowledge of who God declares himself to be in his word, because they've never been trained in the scriptures. But they're all born again believers. So they don't need to be preached to anymore, and they don't need to be evangelized. But what they need is they need to be taught the scriptures. They need to be discipled, because these are brand new baby Christians. They need to be raised. They need a shepherd to shepherd them, which makes us kind of think of Chuck Smith in the Jesus Revolution movie, where the hippies, they needed someone to shepherd them, to teach them the scriptures. And so Barnabas, he realizes this, and he remembers a man who was the most trained Pharisee he had ever met, who had more knowledge of the scriptures than anyone he knew, that would be perfect for this task. And so this guy that had once persecuted the church and consented to Stephen's stoning, that was knocked off his high horse by Jesus himself on that road to Damascus, the same one who Barnabas introduced to the apostles when the apostles wanted nothing to do with him, this Saul of Tarsus, it makes sense. It makes sense why these two had met over 10 years before this. Because Paul, he was called to be the apostle to the Gentiles, where he can teach all these brand new Christians the Bible, because he is a former rabbi who actually is a Hellenist himself. So he doesn't only just understand the Hebrew scriptures, but he also understands the Greek mind. So he'll be able to communicate to these people. And what seems funny here is that Barnabas, he could have picked Nicholas, And Nicholas, he was another one of those 7 deacons picked to serve tables, because Nicholas, he was from Antioch, but Barnabas, he didn't do that. And that's because Paul is the one who's chosen to be the apostle to the Gentiles. And I don't know if this is true or not, but church history says that Irenaeus, who was one of the early church fathers around this era, that he said that Nicholas, that one guy that was picked, one of the 7 deacons, that he became the founder of the Nicolaitans, which the doctrines Jesus said he hated in his letter to the church of Ephesus in the book of Revelation. And so if that's true, it makes sense why God wouldn't have chose Nicholas to teach these new converts. But now it's been over 10 years since Barnabas and Saul have last met. And some people, they say it's been about 12 years. We're up to this time. All we know about Paul is that he was almost killed in Damascus, and he was led over that wall in a basket, and that he spent 3 years in Arabia. And then he had that short little trip to Jerusalem where he met Peter and James. And then he was rejected by his old buddies from the synagogue. And then he went home to Tarsus, where that's where he's been for all this time. But we have no record of what he did there. And the way I look at that, I think, sometimes we end up with these large gaps of time in our lives where we don't think the Lord has any use for us. Where at one time, we may have thought we were called to something big, but nothing happened. Where we just settled down and we're content to just be a Christian. Where we don't see what we thought were God's purposes coming out of our lives. And then all of a sudden, one day, a guy shows up from our past who invites us to this new work that's going on, to a Jesus movement, to a Jesus revolution. And he tells you that he thought of you, that you would be the perfect fit for this ministry. But this doesn't mean that God wasn't doing a work in Paul's life through all these years. I'm sure God was doing a work in Paul's life, just like I'm sure that God does a work in our lives when we haven't been active. But I do believe that God was preparing his servant in building the things inside of him, the things that he will need in this new ministry. And some people think that Paul may have planted a church in Cilicia during those 10 years, which is mentioned in Galatians chapter 1. And then some people think that he may have endured some of the suffering that he talks about in 2 Corinthians chapter 11. But nobody can say for sure what Paul was doing during those years. And then the words in verse 25 where it says that Barnabas departed for Tarsus to seek Saul, that literally means to hunt him up, which this was a laborious task and a laborious search on Barnabas's part. It wasn't easy to find him. And so now, bringing Paul back with him, back here to Antioch, Paul and Barnabas, they start to teach the disciples, these new believers, for a whole year. And from now on, it's this church that's in Antioch that will replace the church in Jerusalem as the greatest sending church in the New Testament, where it's also here up in Antioch where the name Christian is first ever used. Where the name Christian, it's only used 3 times in the New Testament. It's used here, and then it's used in Acts 20, and then in 1 Peter chapter 4. And that name Christian, it's actually made up of 2 words, with the first word being Greek, which is Christ, which means anointed, which is the Greek word for Messiah. And then they took that Greek word and they matched it up with a Latin suffix, an IAN. And that Latin suffix means to the party of. And so what a Christian means is belonging to the party of Christ. But it's kind of more like saying Jesusites or Jesus people or Christ's ones. And it's the same suffix that they used to use for soldiers that were being recognized of being under a certain general's command, where they would just use the general's name and then they would add IAN. So it'd be like McCarthy Ian or maybe Powell Ian or something like that. And so it's basically saying that Jesus is their general. And this name that was given to them, it was meant to be derogatory. But these early believers, they didn't feel insulted at all, and they actually liked the name, so it stuck, because they were happy to be called Christ followers. Where today, the name Christian has pretty much lost its original meaning. Where today, all it means is that you're not a pagan, or maybe it means you're an American, or you might belong to some organizational group called a church. It doesn't really mean being a daily follower of Jesus Christ. But these guys that are called Christians here, they all suffered for being labeled as a Christian. It wasn't that they just ate hot dogs and owned guns. And then we come to this last part of chapter 11, where we see these prophets in the church, that they come to Antioch from Jerusalem. And then there's a specific prophet named Agabus, and he tells them that there's about to be this great famine in the whole world. And it tells us here that it came in the time of Claudius Caesar. And we'll see that famine appear when we get to Acts 21. And there were 4 famines recorded at this period of history. There were 2 famines in Rome, and there was 1 in Greece, and then there was 1 in Judea. And Josephus, he wrote about the one in Judea, where he says that many of the people, they lost their lives for not being enough food available for the people to eat. But here, the Antioch church, this new church birthed out of this Jesus revolution, they wanted to help their fellow Christians down in Judea. And since they can't stop the famine, what they can do is that they can send them relief so that they can make it through the famine. And it was only right for them to help them financially, to support them, because of what the Jewish church did for them spiritually. And so the Gentiles helping the Jews here is helping these believers to become one body of believers called the church, made up of Jews and Gentiles being one in Jesus Christ. And that's why it's important for us not to forget our support for foreign missionaries, especially for our brothers in other countries when they have hard times, because we are one body. And this act, it actually helped close the gap between them, where you see Paul and Barnabas being picked. I figure that's because they're both Jews, and to try to make this as sensitive as they can in this culture, so it'd make it easy and non-offensive for the church in Jerusalem to receive it. And so now just a little note on prophecy. We here at Calvary Chapel, we do believe in the gift of prophecy, the same kind of prophecy that's being displayed here. But we don't believe that everyone who says they have a special revelation has a word from God. And that sometimes that kind of belief or that kind of work, it can be dangerous, and it should be treated as suspect, because there are a lot of false prophets. And I don't speak for Calvary Chapel, but I've heard many more false prophets than true prophets in the church today. And with these false prophets, where they fit in that passage in Jeremiah 23, which says that you fill with false hopes, speaking a vision from their own hearts and not out of the mouth of the Lord. The one last thing we see here is that we see that the church in Jerusalem, that it's changed from the very beginning of the book of Acts. Where in the beginning of the book of Acts, it said that nobody had any needs. Well, now they have needs. And so that type of governments where they shared everything, that was only for the very beginning with the church getting started. Because now the church is having many needs that are not being filled, and that sharing is having to come from others outside of their church. All right.
To let it go.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,